an illegitimate pregnancy, and a secret marriage. Treason! Lock them in the Tower for betraying the state, Elizabeth I fumed. After the death of her sister, Jane Grey, Catherine Grey became the successor to Queen Elizabeth Tudor as the next heir to the English throne. Born in 1540, Catherine enjoyed the favor of many English nobles. However, the Queen despised her cousin so intensely that it was said Elizabeth could not bear the sight of her. Elizabeth I understood all too well the dangers of having a named heir to the throne. For years, she herself had been the heir to her sister Mary I, during which time many nobles dissatisfied with Mary's regime courted Elizabeth and tried to involve her in treasonous plots. During Mary's reign, Elizabeth lived in constant fear for her life, as her name was repeatedly invoked by traitors, whether she supported their schemes or not. Similarly, Lady Catherine Grey found herself a magnet for Elizabeth's political enemies, both at home and abroad. Rumors swirled that Henry II of France planned to spirit Catherine out of England and marry her to his son or another nobleman to keep her close at hand as a rival claimant to the English throne. Similar plots were discussed by the Spanish ambassador, who suggested luring Catherine to Spain to oppose Elizabeth from abroad. Catherine Grey enjoyed the attention of foreign diplomats, and as the Queen denied her the status due to her rank, excluding her from the Privy Chamber, Catherine sought to retaliate. On one occasion, she reportedly that uttered very haughty and indecent words in the presence of the Queen and her court. This rash act would later cost her dearly when she found herself in need of Elizabeth's mercy. Young and beautiful, Catherine fell in love with Edward Seymour, the eldest son of the Duchess of Somerset. Their romance began late in Queen Mary's reign, while Catherine was living at Anne Seymour's residence in Hanworth. It was there that Edward first fell for Catherine and began speaking of marriage. Lady Catherine became a close friend of Edward's younger sister, Lady Jane Seymour, whom the young Earl planned to use as the sole instrument or means to achieve his goal, in other words, to arrange a suitable marriage. Edward was handsome but impulsive and capricious, rebellious and headstrong, as his mother described him. Yet he was not as reckless as she believed. When news of his secret marriage later surfaced, Edward tried to protect those who had been complicit in it. Catherine Grey later claimed that Edward visited her mother, Lady Frances, to secure her approval for the marriage. Edward said Frances treated him with great kindness and called him son, implying she approved of him as a potential husband for her daughter. With her husband's help, Frances wrote a letter to Queen Elizabeth seeking her consent for the marriage. Frances pleaded that the marriage was the only thing she desired before her death and would bring her peace of mind for her daughter's future. Unfortunately for the young couple, Frances died before she could send the letter. Left without her mother's guidance, Catherine essentially became an orphan. Taking matters into her own hands, she accepted Edward's proposal, and with the help of his sister Jane, the brave trio devised plans for a secret wedding ceremony. The couple married sometime between the 1st of November and the 25th of December 1560. All three suspected the Queen would never grant permission for the union, so the women lied to their sovereign to evade their courtly duty. Catherine claimed her face was swollen and that she could not accompany the Queen to Eltham for a hunt. Jane offered to stay behind to care for her friend. The next day, Catherine married Edward at his house on Cannon Row in Westminster. Lady Jane, who acted as the sole witness, found a priest to conduct the clandestine ceremony. Catherine and Edward, now the Earl of Hertford, continued to meet in secret in the months that followed. Their acquaintance became increasingly evident at court. William Cecil, the Queen's Secretary of State, sought to separate the couple and arranged for Hertford to leave for France to complete his education. By the time Edward departed for France in May 1561, Catherine suspected she was pregnant. Lacking knowledge about pregnancy, she couldn't confirm it before her husband's departure. Before leaving, Edward gave her a document bequeathing her £1,000 in widow's inheritance should he die abroad. After Edward's departure, Catherine remained in the Queen's service as a lady-in-waiting. To her horror, she realized their secret marriage was not as hidden as they had hoped. A brief conversation with William Cecil shattered any illusions. It was clear that he had orchestrated her husband's departure. Cecil advised her to tread carefully in her dealings with the Earl, without involving the Queen. He knew about their marriage, though it had not been formally acknowledged. Catherine was warned repeatedly about the dangers of continuing her relationship with Edward behind the Queen's back. However, young, naive, and in love, she denied the existence of the marriage to both Cecil and others. Regardless, it was already too late to conceal their union, as Catherine's pregnancy became increasingly apparent. She managed to disguise her growing belly with loose-fitting dresses for several months, but by the summer of 1561, court gossip was rampant. By the 7th month of her pregnancy, when the child was kicking vigorously, Catherine wrote to Edward begging him to return. Her letter went unanswered. Desperate, she turned to Bess Cavendish, a former servant of her late mother and her godmother, on the 9th of August 1561. Lady St. Lou, as Bess was then known, was one of the Queen's favourites, and Catherine hoped she could help. Instead, she was met with bitter disappointment. Upon learning of Catherine's secret marriage and pregnancy, Lady St. Lou wept and expressed deep regret that she had not informed the Queen earlier. Despairing, Catherine sought support from Robert Dudley. Late one night, she knelt by his bedside, tearfully imploring him to speak to the Queen on her behalf. Unfortunately for Catherine, Dudley reported her secret marriage and pregnancy to Elizabeth. The following day, the Queen ordered her cousin to be imprisoned in the Tower of London. Catherine and Edward suspected that Queen Elizabeth would object to their marriage but failed to realize one crucial fact: the marriage of Lady Catherine, a royal heir, was a matter of state. Under the Royal Marriage Act of 1536, any marriage involving a person of royal blood without the monarch's consent was considered an act of treason. Catherine's pregnancy only deepened Elizabeth's outrage, and she immediately launched an investigation. On the 22nd of August 1561, news of Lady Catherine Grey's arrest reached the ears of Edward's mother, Anne Seymour, Duchess of Somerset. Shocked, the Duchess wrote to William Cecil, pleading for fair treatment of her son and daughter-in-law, and asserting that she had no knowledge of their marriage, nor had she given her approval. When Edward returned from France, he was immediately imprisoned in the Tower and interrogated. He admitted that his mother was unaware of the marriage, but acknowledged that she knew of his affection for Catherine. Anne Seymour had cautioned her son to keep his distance from Catherine, but he ignored her warnings. On the 24th of September 1561, Catherine gave birth to a son, whom she named Edward after his father. Despite the baby's royal lineage, Queen Elizabeth refused to recognize him as an heir. She appointed a commission to investigate the marriage's legality, aiming to discredit and annul the union. Elizabeth was determined to prove the marriage invalid, branding Catherine a liar and a harlot. The Queen argued that the marriage could not be valid, as there were no witnesses apart from Catherine and Edward. Both insisted they were legally married, but when questioned about witnesses or others who could corroborate their claims, they were unable to provide definitive proof. The identity of the priest who conducted the ceremony remained unknown, and the sole witness, Lady Jane Seymour, had died of tuberculosis on the 19th of March 1561. On the 12th of May 1562, after extensive interrogations of both Catherine and Edward, their marriage was declared invalid and their son was deemed illegitimate. Edward was found guilty of engaging in relations with a woman of royal blood without the Queen's permission and was declared a traitor. Public opinion in England was divided. Some viewed the Queen's actions as justified, while others believed Catherine and Edward were indeed married. Additionally, unlike Elizabeth, Catherine had already provided an heir, which bolstered her supporters. Sympathetic guards allowed Catherine and Edward to spend 2 nights together in her quarters in the Tower, resulting in the birth of a second son, Thomas, on the 10th of February 1563. This infuriated Queen Elizabeth even further. Edward was fined an enormous sum, and his imprisonment was extended. When the plague swept through London in the summer of 1563, Queen Elizabeth relocated Catherine from the Tower to a more isolated location, away from the outbreak. However, she showed no signs of releasing Edward. Lady Catherine and her younger son Thomas were sent to live at the estate of her uncle, Sir John Grey, in Essex. Initially, there were hopes that the Queen might forgive the couple, but those hopes were soon dashed. As it became clear that Catherine's house arrest would last much longer than expected, she fell into a deep depression. Her uncle wrote to William Cecil about her refusal to eat and her increasing despondency. In her despair, Catherine wrote a humiliating letter of apology to the Queen, but it went unanswered. Her mental and physical health deteriorated further as she languished in confinement. She was barely 25 years old, yet her health was severely compromised by starvation, constant tears, and unrelenting sorrow. Adding to her troubles, disputes arose between the Grey and Seymour families over who should bear the cost of Catherine's upkeep. John Grey, her uncle, had been responsible for her care since the first day she and her son Thomas arrived at his home. Grey grew increasingly resentful of the expenses and believed the Seymours, as Edward's family, should shoulder the financial burden. In a scathing letter to William Cecil, Grey complained that the Seymours had promised new bedding and linens for Catherine, but failed to deliver. He also noted that she lacked funds even to send New Year's gifts to her friends in London. Cecil, sympathetic to the situation, enlisted the help of Robert Dudley. Together they wrote a letter to Edward, gently urging him to allocate £114 toward Catherine's maintenance. In the spring of 1564, Anne Seymour, Duchess of Somerset, travelled to court to personally appeal to Robert Dudley, seeking royal mercy for her son and daughter-in-law. Dudley's motives for assisting the Seymours remain unclear. Perhaps he felt a moral obligation, as his father had ordered the execution of Edward's father, the Duke of Somerset. Despite these efforts, Catherine's situation worsened when John Hales, a fervent Protestant, published a treatise on the succession. Hales argued that Catherine Grey, as a descendant of Mary Tudor, French queen, the younger sister of Henry VIII, had a stronger claim to the English throne than Mary, Queen of Scots, who was both foreign and Catholic. The publication of John Hales's treatise only exacerbated Catherine's predicament. While Queen Elizabeth had previously viewed Catherine's secret marriage as a personal affront, Hales's arguments transformed her into a political threat. Protestant reformers disillusioned with Elizabeth's policies saw Catherine as a preferable alternative to Mary, Queen of Scots. Hales's assertion that Catherine's claim to the throne was superior due to her descent from Henry VII's sister Mary Tudor and adherence to Protestantism infuriated the Queen. His treatise emphasized the importance of respecting Henry VII's will, which excluded foreigners like Mary, Queen of Scots, from the English succession. Fearing that Catherine's supporters might rally against her, Elizabeth tightened surveillance on Catherine and Edward. Both were now prisoners under stricter conditions. Edward remained in the Tower of London, while Catherine was transferred to the custody of Sir Owen Hopton, a staunch royalist who resided at Cockfield Hall in Suffolk. Catherine's movements were severely restricted. She was not allowed outside the estate and could not dine with her host's guests. By 1568, after 5 years of imprisonment, 27-year-old Catherine was a shadow of her former self. Once a radiant blonde with clear blue eyes and a complexion like milk, she was now pale, frail, and visibly aged. Her physical and emotional health had been ravaged by malnutrition, grief, and despair. In early January 1568, Catherine's declining health became evident to Sir Owen Hopton, who notified William Cecil and requested the services of the royal physician. Catherine's attendants held out hope for her recovery, reassuring her that she would soon regain her strength. "Madam, do not despair," they implored. "With God's help, you will live and thrive for many more years." "No," Catherine replied. "There is no life in this world, but I hope to live eternally in the next. Here, there are only cares and suffering, there, everlasting life." As her condition worsened, Catherine spent her nights in prayer, preparing herself for death. When she lost consciousness, her attendants rubbed her hands and feet to revive her, but Catherine was resigned to her fate. Early one morning, she summoned Sir Owen Hopton to her bedside. When he inquired about her health, she replied, "I am going to God." Wishing to die with a clear conscience, she asked for forgiveness from God and the entire world. She made a final plea to Sir Owen, "I beg the Queen's forgiveness. I confess that I gravely wronged her by making my choice without her knowledge. I ask that she be kind to my children and not hold them accountable for my sins." Catherine entrusted Sir Owen with a diamond ring to deliver to her husband as a token of her love. "Is this your wedding ring?" Sir Owen asked. "No, my wedding ring is in the casket." Here it is, Catherine said, producing another ring engraved with the words, "As long as I live, I am yours." Glancing down at her frail hands, Catherine noticed her fingernails had turned purple. "Welcome, death," she exclaimed with a strange sense of relief. Catherine Grey passed away at 9 o'clock on the 27th of January 1568. Queen Elizabeth feigned sorrow at Catherine's death, but her true feelings were far from grief. Elizabeth's reaction was driven more by relief than remorse, as she perceived Catherine's passing as a safeguard for her throne. Despite her outward show of sympathy, Elizabeth ensured Catherine was buried without the grandeur befitting a member of the royal family. The modest ceremony reflected the Queen's disdain. Catherine, who had once been a contender for the throne, was laid to rest quietly and without the honours accorded to others of her rank. Even some of Elizabeth's friends, such as Lady Brooke and the Duchess of Somerset, had received more lavish funerals. Catherine had never aspired to be queen. All she had ever wanted was to be happy and loved. Catherine's two sons, Edward and Thomas, were entrusted to the care of their grandmother, Anne Seymour, Duchess of Somerset. Edward Seymour, Catherine's husband, remained imprisoned. His captivity dragged on for years, compounded by an enormous fine that proved insurmountable. He was only released in the 1590s, decades after Catherine's death. Tragically, even after Catherine's passing, the question of the English succession remained unresolved. Many people, particularly those dissatisfied with Elizabeth's refusal to name an heir, continued to advocate for Catherine's sons as rightful claimants to the throne. In October 1572, Queen Elizabeth fell ill with smallpox for the second time. The possibility of her death reignited debates about the succession. Once again, some suggested that Catherine Grey's sons should inherit the throne. Faced with the potential collapse of her dynasty, Elizabeth, ever defiant, changed her mind about dying and recovered from her illness.